History loves heavy armor. It remembers war through steel thickness, through barrel length, through the terrifying silhouettes of machines built to dominate the battlefield. We are taught that power decides battles, that the side with the biggest gun, the thickest plate, the most fearsome tank will inevitably prevail. But history also hides quieter truths. In December of 1944, deep in the frozen Ardennes, German armored crews would learn one of those truths the hard way. They would face an enemy that didn't try to overpower them, an enemy that refused to fight on expected terms, an enemy that turned time, distance, and movement into weapons. In that winter fog, speed would become deadlier than armor. December 19th, 1944. Outside the small Belgian village of Noville, German Panther crews began reporting encounters that defied logic. American tanks seemed to materialize out of the fog itself. A flash of movement, a single gunshot slamming into a Panther's side armor, and then, nothing. The attacker vanished before the turret could even begin to swing. Minutes later, it happened again. Same outcome, different direction. Confused and increasingly alarmed, German officers rushed intelligence reports up the chain of command. The conclusion seemed obvious. They believed they had blundered into far larger American armored forces operating around Noville. They were completely wrong. The Americans didn't have a division. They barely had a company. What they did have was a small number of tank destroyers, light, fast vehicles weighing just 18 tons. Machines with armor so thin they wouldn't survive a single clean hit from a German gun. On paper, they should have been slaughtered. But paper didn't matter in the fog. The M18 Hellcat was the fastest tracked armored fighting vehicle of the Second World War to see widespread combat service. And on that frozen morning near Bastogne, speed was rewriting the rules of armored combat. Germany had built legends on steel. The Tiger, the Panther. These were not just tanks, they were symbols of dominance. Their guns could destroy Allied armor from distances exceeding a mile. Their frontal armor was nearly impervious to most Allied weapons. Yet beneath that reputation lay a flaw no amount of engineering brilliance had fully solved. German turrets were slow. The Tiger I relied on a hydraulic turret traverse system powered directly by the main engine and gearbox. At high engine revolutions, the turret could complete a full rotation in roughly 60 seconds. But tanks don't fight at high RPM. They fight while stationary or creeping forward cautiously at idle. At idle speed, that same Tiger turret could take several minutes to rotate a full circle. If the hydraulic system failed, as it often did under combat stress, the crew was forced to traverse the turret by hand. 720 turns of a handwheel for a single full rotation. An eternity in combat. The Panther improved on this design, but the improvement wasn't enough. At combat idle, rotating the turret just 90 degrees could take 15 to 20 seconds. Against a slow frontal assault, that delay was survivable. Against the right enemy, it was fatal. The idea that such a weakness could be exploited had been dismissed until a quiet, methodical officer began asking the wrong questions. In 1941, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Davis Bruce was placed in command of the Tank Destroyer Tactical and Firing Center. His assignment was brutally simple: figure out how to stop German panzers. Bruce didn't chase myths, he studied reality. He analyzed blitzkrieg tactics. He dissected after-action reports. He examined every engagement where Allied tanks had met German armor and lost. And from those losses, he reached a conclusion that directly contradicted the Army's doctrine. Tank destroyers should not be armored like tanks. They should be fast, not built to absorb punishment, but to avoid it. German tanks were designed to dominate frontal engagements. Their weakest point was never their gun or their armor. It was their reaction time. Their turrets were slow, their hulls slower, their side armor thin. Bruce envisioned a vehicle that didn't fight tanks head-on, a vehicle that struck from the flank, fired once, and vanished before the enemy could respond. A machine that relied on movement, not protection. The Army thought the idea bordered on insanity. They approved it, reluctantly. For the men who would crew these vehicles, the concept was terrifying. They were being asked to trade steel for speed, to accept that survival depended not on armor thickness, but on timing, awareness, and nerve. In 1942, Buick's Motor Division received the contract. Harley Earl's design studio, better known for shaping America's future automobiles, was tasked with turning Bruce's theory into metal. What they produced was unlike anything else in the American arsenal. The M18 Hellcat weighed just 18 tons. A Panther weighed 45. A Tiger weighed 57. The weight savings came from ruthless decisions. The Hellcat's frontal hull armor was only 13 millimeters thick. The turret face barely reached 25. Standard infantry rifles couldn't penetrate it. Almost everything else could. When crews first saw the specifications, disbelief turned into dark humor. 13 millimeters wasn't armor, it was skin. They joked the steel was only there to keep the wind out. Inside the Hellcat, you weren't protected, you were merely hidden. But what the Hellcat lacked in armor, it made up for in raw mobility. Its engine was a Wright R975 radial, the same aircraft engine used in the Sherman tank, installed in a vehicle half the weight. The result was extraordinary, a top speed of 55 miles per hour. No other tracked vehicle in the war came close. The name fit perfectly, Hellcat. The mathematics of combat told the real story. At 30 miles per hour, an M18 covered 44 feet every second. In the 15 seconds a Panther needed to rotate its turret 90 degrees, a Hellcat could move over 600 feet, 200 yards of lateral movement. Enough to stay ahead of the gun barrel, enough to stay alive. German gunners were forced into impossible calculations. Lead the target and hope it maintained its course, or track it and watch shells slam harmlessly into empty ground where it had been moments earlier. Either way, they rarely got a second chance. While the German turret struggled to turn, the Hellcat was already lining up a 76mm round into exposed side armor. The Hellcat's turret was fast, but that wasn't the real advantage. The true weapon was the vehicle itself. It could reposition faster than a German turret could react. That was the arithmetic of survival. And in the frozen chaos around Bastogne, that arithmetic was about to be proven, one ambush at a time. By December 1944, the German war machine was bleeding, but it was not finished. In one final gamble, the Wehrmacht hurled everything it had left into the Ardennes forest. Fuel, armor, men, spent recklessly in the hope of breaking the Allied line and turning the tide of the war. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne found itself surrounded. Attached to them was the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Templeton. When German armor from the 2nd Panzer Division began pushing toward the village of Noville, just north of Bastogne, Templeton's battalion was ordered forward to help hold the line. They were folded into Team de Sobry, a mixed improvised force of Sherman tanks, M18 Hellcats, and paratroopers from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The task force commander was Major William Desabry. He was 26 years old, and he was about to face an entire German Panzer division. The fog that blanketed the Ardennes was so thick that visibility collapsed to mere yards. Engagements erupted at point-blank range, often without warning. At that distance, the Hellcat's thin armor was a death sentence. A single solid hit could tear the vehicle apart. But first, the Germans had to hit them. Inside the Hellcats, tension pressed down like a physical weight. The M18 had no roof. Its open turret left crews exposed to freezing rain, drifting snow, sniper fire, and the constant thunder of artillery. Wind cut through the fighting compartment. Fingers numbed, faces burned. In the fog, every shadow looked like a tiger. From that chaos, the 705th developed a method that would become legendary. A Hellcat would sprint to a street corner in Noville. The gunner would catch a glimpse of a Panther through the mist. One shot, aimed at the flank. Then full reverse, engine screaming. By the time the Panther's turret began to traverse, the Hellcat was already gone, vanished behind a building, down an alley, repositioning. Moments later, the same Hellcat would strike again. This time from the opposite side of the German column. Another shot, another kill, another disappearance. The Germans could not track them. Every time they turned to engage one threat, another appeared somewhere else. Reports flowing back to 2nd Panzer Division headquarters grew increasingly frantic. German officers were convinced they were being attacked from all directions by a full American armored division. In reality, they were fighting a single reinforced battalion, led by a 26-year-old major and a handful of tank destroyers that refused to stand still. Speed saved many men, but it did not save everyone. With only 13 millimeters of armor, any hit was usually fatal. German 75mm shells punched through both sides of the hull. Crews caught in the open died instantly. Those who mistimed their maneuvers died, and those who were simply unlucky faced a particularly brutal fate. The Hellcat's open turret meant that artillery airbursts and mortar rounds didn't need direct hits. Shrapnel rained down directly into the fighting compartment. Steel fragments, jagged and invisible, tore through flesh. The Hellcat was fast, but it was also a cold, open grave if you stopped moving. Colonel Templeton drove his men hard because he understood the alternative. Static defense meant annihilation. Movement, constant, relentless movement, was survival. Over December 19th and 20th, Team de Sobry and the 705th destroyed more than 30 German tanks around Noville. The village eventually fell. The American force was simply too small to hold against the full weight of the 2nd Panzer Division. But they had accomplished something far more important. They had bought time. Critical hours, long enough for the 101st Airborne to establish the defensive perimeter that would hold Bastogne. Templeton survived the Battle of the Bulge. He continued commanding the battalion through the drive into Germany. On March 1, 1945, an artillery shell struck his command post. He never lived to see the victory his tactics helped secure. 4 months later, the Hellcat would prove its mathematics again, this time in an entirely different theater. In Italy, the 805th Tank Destroyer Battalion was the only American unit fully equipped with M18 Hellcats. Their commander was Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Fowler. The crews painted unauthorized black cat insignias on their turrets, a cartoon feline biting into a tank, set against an orange disc. Command ordered them to remove the markings. They refused. It was a small act of rebellion, but it mattered. These men were driving the most fragile armored vehicles in the theater. That cat was their way of baring their teeth. If they were going to fight, and possibly die in these machines, they would do so under their own symbol. In April 1945, the Allies launched their final offensive in Italy. After months of brutal fighting through the Apennine Mountains, the Po Valley opened ahead, flat, wide, and exposed. German forces were in retreat. Columns of trucks, half-tracks, and tanks streamed north toward the Alps. The soldiers called what followed the rat race. The Po Valley was perfect Hellcat terrain, open ground, long sight lines, no forests or hills to slow them down. The 805th found themselves driving not behind retreating German columns, but alongside them. At 30 miles per hour, they would pull level and open fire. 76mm guns tore through trucks, half-tracks, and tanks from the flank. German gunners cranked their turrets in panic, but the geometry was hopeless. By the time a gun came around, the Hellcat that fired was already 200 yards farther down the column. It was a drive-by shooting, on an armored scale. Because the 805th was the only Hellcat battalion in the entire Italian theater, German intelligence was baffled. A black cat reported near Bologna in the morning would be sighted 50 miles north by afternoon. The pursuit moved so fast that crews couldn't even guard prisoners. They disarmed them, pointed them toward the rear, and kept moving. Veterans later recalled the surreal nature of the chase, the wind tearing through the open turret, speeding past enemy infantry too stunned to fire, the feeling that they were hunting rather than fighting. By the end of the war, the M18 Hellcat had achieved one of the highest kill ratios of any American armored vehicle, with hundreds of confirmed kills. An exchange ratio of roughly 2.4 to 1, better than the Sherman, rivaling the M10, better than anything else the Americans fielded. Critics argued the Hellcat's success lay not in its design, but in its crews. Historian Stephen Zaloga called it a poorly balanced vehicle, claiming elite training, not engineering, won the day. Maybe he was right, but vehicles shape behavior. The Hellcat allowed speed, flanking, and hit-and-run warfare. A different machine would have forced different tactics, and those tactics might have cost more lives. The M18 was retired almost immediately after the war. Tank destroyer doctrine faded. The U.S. Army embraced heavily armored main battle tanks. The cruiser philosophy was abandoned, but the lesson remained. German tankers couldn't hit what they couldn't track. 15 seconds of turret traverse was an eternity against a vehicle moving 44 feet per second. Panthers and Tigers were better tanks by every conventional measure, but conventional measures didn't account for an 18-ton machine that could be somewhere else before you finished turning your gun. At Noville, the 705th used speed to survive impossible odds. In the Po Valley, the 805th used speed to annihilate a retreating army. Both proved the same truth.